Hi, I'm John Davison, founder of Startup Landia and CTO, and I'm a person that runs a channel called jdtalks.ai. And today, across the pond from me is Kirsten Newbold-Knip. She's a serial CEO, venture investor, marketing professional, and all-around red fridge badass, to put it in the modern parlance. And today we are going to talk a little bit about her career, and we're going to dive and dissect into a kind of a question she had asked me a month and a half ago at the Red Fridge when she was like, these consultants are talking to me about replacing all of our engineers with coding agents. And I was like, wow, that's not a hypothetical ask. That's a very real ask from a CEO who is very curious about what to do. And I'm thinking to myself, either road you take, messing up the decision has huge implications. So I was like, that's a very interesting question for me. And then we'll talk about a few other things. Kirsten, hello, welcome, and good morning.
Thanks so much, John. Excited to be here, and I had a lot of fun to be able to continue our conversation that started on a couch and moving into a
On the
podcast.
couch,
So lots
the
of
red
it.
fridge couch.
The beverage couch, indeed. Yeah.
So before we dig into some of the more meaty topics, would you just be interested in giving us sort of broad strokes of your career?
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit of a non-traditional start in getting in tech, but my background is one of a combination of careers. I'm sort of in career two right now. First career, I went into hospitality. I worked in hotels for 4 years and wanted to be a general manager of a hotel, and realized about 3 years in that loved parts of the work, but also saw that the career path wasn't optimal. And I fell into something really lucky, and that's actually one or two of the things that you'll see is like being in the right place, right time, and saying, I want to take a risk is one of the things that I think has been really helpful for me in my career, because I was in the right time in that I was probably the youngest, most technically savvy person at the Ritz-Carlton in Palm Beach in the events team. And they were rolling out new software. Micros Fidelio was going to bring basically ERP for events, and Ritz-Carlton was a beta customer. And they're like, you're young. You seem like you could do this. Why don't you be the guinea pig? And I said, sure, that sounds fun. And during that process, I got to meet the product manager, right, as one does through a big experience. And this person's role was so interesting. I thought, you are changing the way we work. You're impacting everyday decisions. You're making our lives easier, theoretically. They needed to do some work on the software, but everything that he was doing in his role was so fascinating to me. And I kind of realized that some of the skills I had in translating customer requirements into events was very much like translating customer needs into potential software products. So I had already made the decision that I wanted to move on from hospitality, hadn't been sure what I wanted to do. And this kind of like pinnacle moment of, I love this idea of product management was what had me pivot into tech. So went to go get my MBA at Sloan, and had an amazing time in Boston. MIT is an unbelievable place to be, and was very humbled by that experience because I was surrounded by people whose horsepower like blew mine out of the water, and was fortunate to then go become a product manager after that. But as you alluded to, fast forward 20 years later, I have largely been on the marketing, go-to-market, and sales side of things before I landed in the CEO seat most recently. But I caught the startup bug at HubSpot, which was another one of those serendipitous moments where after two really big companies, kind of startups inside huge companies, I found myself thinking, gosh, I would like to make an impact faster. And a good friend from my Sloan days had said, hey, we're doing this thing called HubSpot up in Boston. Do you want to come take a try? And took what I thought was one of the biggest risks of my career, and ultimately turned out to be one of the best outcomes of my career in terms of both learning, growth, and really, really good outcome from a business standpoint. So fast forward, here we sit, a couple of IPOs later, lots of sales and marketing leadership roles later. I've most recently been the CEO at a software company that makes CX software, and found myself pondering a lot of the existential questions that we're gonna ask about.
There is like infinite jump off points of interest for me in there. Um, let's see. The hotel and restaurant management degree from Cornell, right? Cornell has the best HRM program in the nation, if I
So
remember
we claim.
correctly.
So we claim,
Yeah.
yeah. I would say it's a very much it's like a business school that has a focus on the business you're in as hotels. So it's this really interesting hybrid of learning all the core functions of how do you run a business, but doing it in the context of guests and service and kind of that ethos, if you will.
And it's super interesting to me because I feel like a lot of times people have not fully understood that the job, you can boil down all the skills, but the job is to be in service to your customers. So it's like such an interesting starting point. And I had like, I was curious, like, people wanted me to be a chef and all that. And they're like, joining, I could have gone down the HRM path and I didn't. But when I arrived in San Francisco, I ended up diving into the craft cocktail bartending scene and I did a lot of parties. And I was like, it's an incredible opportunity to just have this singular moment of doing something nice for somebody that makes them feel better. And I was like, I think that's an important business skill because like sometimes that's all your job is, right?
100%. I mean, honestly, like a couple of the things that I picked up, and for anybody that's maybe someone who's like, I look at this current wave of AI, and there are probably people in non-tech roles thinking, should I jump in? What should I do? Right? If you've been in a service role, I actually think there's no better place to be because the way AI is changing it, the human aspect is going to be the hardest part, is the part that we lack in many cases. And I think the service industry does prepare you in ways you couldn't imagine. Like three things that I'll share that I thought were particularly interesting in my experience that maybe parallel some things you've seen. But I was 20 when I started working. I happened to be kind of young, getting out of college. And in my first role, I only had two direct reports, but I very quickly was promoted because another person quit. And they're like, why don't you take over this team? Which is kind of like the story of my life. Why don't you take this over? And
Hmm.
within 6 months, I had 22 direct reports that ranged in age from 16 to 76. And I was 20 years
Wow.
old, right?
Wow.
To figure out, did I do a perfect
A
job?
prodigy. You're like a services prodigy.
Well, it's also like I had to learn like how do you motivate a 76-year-old gentleman who has never worked for a woman before, much less a 20-year-old, right? That would like some of those were some of the hardest things I've ever had to do, and I did them really early. So it's motivating your team and figuring out what makes them tick, but it's also getting very accustomed to talking to very very high-end customers, and they may be angry for any reason that has nothing to do with you, but your job is to your point, make
Yeah.
them feel seen, heard, felt, make it right. And I think that, right, this managing a very diverse set of people, really, really important and something you learn interestingly in hospitality because your team's going to be highly diverse. Getting comfortable with uncomfortable situations because customers and guests are hard. And then the third I would say is actually there's a stamina. I think that when you have in the service industry that sometimes folks who start in a 9 to 5 type job kind of have this sort of mentality of clocking in and clocking out. But if you're in management in a hotel, there is no clocking in and clocking out.
It's like
It,
2:30 in the morning. You're
totally.
there.
Yeah, startup hours. People are like, "Oh, startup hours are hard." I'm like, seriously? Have you ever worked in a hotel? It's
Yeah.
no biggie. Yeah.
Yeah. That was actually one of the reasons I definitely didn't want to do professional bartending. I was like, I just don't, I was like, it's cool to be out till 4 a.m. sometimes, but as a night, as a daily experience, I don't have that in
The
me.
lifestyle. I agree. I agree.
So two tangents related to services. Are you like, of course, you've probably read the case studies on like the Hilton and their training programs and how they've just like really nailed how to instill sort of like, you're basically the CEO's representative no matter where you are in the organization, which I think is an incredible like so you're familiar with that stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say probably even more familiar with like Horst Schulze, who was the CEO, founding CEO of Ritz-Carlton, and then
Mm.
pushed a lot of his thinking throughout. We basically had a credo card, and it said, "We're ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen," and there were a number of values that were part of it. Whether it's Hilton or Marriott or you name it, the idea that you need to be empowered to be able to take care of the customer at any moment in time, and that you are kind of the CEO of your function, right? When it's you and the customer, you and the guest having an interaction, you're empowered to make a decision to make their experience better. And that ability to create comfort and confidence that they can take care of a guest is really important so that you can do it fast. And in fact, I would say that was one of the things that drew me to my most recent role at Ask Nicely. The philosophy is that feedback from guests and customers doesn't belong just in the boardroom. It belongs to the employees themselves, right? How are they going to improve their craft? How are they going to create a better experience if they don't know within 24 hours that something they did was really well received or landed with a bit of a thud?
Um, I was listening to Founders podcast, and Jensen Huang is famous for sort of like praise and praise and shame in public,
Public.
in contrast to the sort of, praise in public and shame in private. And I'm curious if you have an opinion on
Awesome.
that. I mean,
Um,
you basically just stated an opinion, which is like share the feedback, probably share it compassionately, but make sure everybody hears it because then it's most valuable.
yes, and so what I would say is
Yes, and is that
and
an improv and?
it is an improv and it is an improv and I've definitely done improv in a couple of team building things and I love it. But the
This is improv.
it's improv. Every day, that's what a podcast is. So I believe 100% praise in public. I think if it's deeply critical, it probably should be in private. I think if it is something that is more around an area of improvement where many people can learn from an accountability, there's a reason to share it in public, but maybe you don't name names, right? I would actually tell you, like back in the day. So first I was at the Breakers and then I was at Ritz-Carlton. Breakers didn't do stand-ups. Ritz-Carlton, we did daily stand-ups. And in our daily stand-ups, we actually would read the most important comment cards for the prior day. We typically read one or two like super happy ones and maybe one or two crappy ones. And in the crappy ones, we didn't name names, but we might say, hey, the banquets department was late with the entrees for this, particular event or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
We didn't say it was Jimmy who was the banquet captain at the time. No, Jimmy knows, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about the fact that this impacted those guests' experiences. And hey, so what would we do next time? What did we learn? Did something happen yesterday? What was going on? Oh, yeah, actually, one of our line cooks was out sick and we didn't have, okay, cool. What can we do differently? So I think I would not ascribe necessarily, I don't know how Jensen delivers it. If he delivers the constructive stuff in public in a way that's compassionate and maybe anonymizes where appropriate, I'm totally supportive because I think there's an accountability to that that's critical. Somebody asked me recently, how do you create a culture of accountability? And for me, it's being transparent, right? In the case of a software business, right? It's talking about the numbers in public, talking about what's going well, what's not. Doesn't mean I need to say, Jimmy did a bad job or Jimmy did a great job, right? It's how do you make sure that there is awareness so that folks can progress? All good over there? Water went down wrong? You okay?
Yes. No, it's just such a pivotal topic you've got going. Thank you. I think another part, at least that's important to me, is that if it's a super sensitive piece of feedback, that the first time somebody gets it, it's generally a one-to-one,
Yes.
so that all useful aspects of like, look, this is here for you and your growth, and it's necessary for you to become better. And then maybe any sorts of incidental parts of feedback related to that particular issue are like fine to talk about in public, assuming that person and you are clear on like what's actually at stake and how that plays out, I think can be, reasonable way to address some of
Totally
that
agree.
stuff.
Actually, I do want to add one insight that was fascinating. One of the changes that we made at Ask Nicely in our product. Uh,
Hmm.
so we have a product that essentially offers direct line of feedback to the frontline employee. So let's say that you, John, were cocktail serving somewhere, although our industries are a little bit less hospitality oriented, more like dental, pest control, those kinds of things where there's a very tight service provider relationship. But what we found is the direct line for praise, super well received. The direct line for customer negative feedback was a bit trickier, right? Some employees are just not ready to receive it, especially if let's say I was a customer and I was really angry, and so the way I offered that feedback, maybe not the most constructive. And what we actually have been building is AI powered and actually
I
related
mean, it's
to
such
it
a good use.
it's such a good use, right? Because it's like instead of saying, hey, the positive, we still shoot right to you. The negative, either we maybe moderate, and in some cases, what we're trying to do right now is create more of a summary so that the frontline manager inside a week can see, oh, John got John got 3 positives on communication, but he got 4 negatives on timeliness. So we now, those 4 negatives on timeliness from an AI standpoint, we can very quickly say, actually, John's biggest area for opportunity is timeliness. We can give that macro level feedback to John without sending him nasty grams, right? Because
Yeah.
all customers or guests are really polite in how they share things, and finding that balance so that, human beings need to receive feedback in certain ways. And there's kind of no other way to do that well if you aren't leveraging some of the AI capabilities out there right now.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, it's such a good use. It's like, hey, here's 1,000 words. How do we sort of guide those words into what is most useful for the recipient?
Yeah.
Because the recipient's not a CEO. They haven't like gone through all the levels. Oh, I'd love to hear 1,000 pieces of negative feedback because that'll make me a CEO.
Yeah, they're like, any piece of negative feedback feels hard. How do you make it so it's constructive?
Yeah. Um, awesome. So then oh, and I guess I don't know why I feel compelled to ask this one about the HRM stuff. I was in a Zoom session like this last month through the Entrepreneurs Cooperative community with Connor Tomkeys, and he actually brought in Chip Connolly to do a small group talk. Do you know Chip Connolly, founder of
I
Joie de
only
Vivre
know that
Hotels?
I know of him a little bit, but I also know he's doing the elder,
Yeah,
why can I think of the name of it?
yeah, elder retreats or
Yeah, elder retreats, sort of like kind of,
elder IQ or
yeah,
elder like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
what do you do when you have a lifespan that could potentially go to 120 and you had an exit when you're 45, you still have like 70 years of life left,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
I
yeah.
think is a very interesting and compelling place to be.
It is. Well, it's something we've got to
Um,
think about, right? When I said I'm on my second career, it's partly because I fully expect there to be a third career. Don't know what it is yet, but I know that even if in 5 years I decide I don't want to be doing, deep execution operation in tech, I don't want to be done.
no. I mean, I was funny. It's like I could tangentialize forever. I was listening to the Founders podcast this morning, and it was the Michael Dell interview. And there was a quote towards the end of the interview about why Michael Dell didn't start it, like why he didn't sort of sell off Dell and try to start another company. He's like, look, this is the company that I started. It has my name on it. There's no point in starting another company because I already have one. It's just useful to improve and fix and evolve this. And then you get to a very, hyperbolic statement. It's like, my exit strategy is death. Like I found what I want to do. I found what I love to do. And that's a very consistent theme in the Founders podcast is that a lot of these people who really find what they love to do, they do it until it's impossible to be done anymore. There's just no point in being like, I'm going to go sit on the beach and do nothing because that's actually not very fun for most of us.
Great.
Okay, so let's dive into the exact phrase or set of questions that led me to be curious about a bunch of this stuff, and actually is what led to me wanting to build this AI mental models workshop. So when we were sitting at the Red Fridge before we went to the UT basketball game, you asked me, or you said to me, hey, these consultants are advising me to potentially get rid of my engineers or stop hiring any more engineers in favor of AI coding agents. And that made me very curious. Here's a CEO asking me, should I actively downgrade engineering spend in favor of AI coding agents? Do you remember the exact question, or have I mostly
Yep, that's
paraphrased
awesome.
it?
I think you've gotten it relatively right, right? It was sort of I was at a conference on with multiple CEOs, and that was the challenge, right? I think they were, what I would say is, I think they were being intentionally provocative, but it was a good question to provoke the thinking of, okay, how many more eng do you need? And what is the level of skill and talent? And it sort of takes you down a rabbit hole as well, that I think many people are talking about is, hey, let's say that you don't hire any more junior engineers, because your seniors are all going to be great at prompting and using cursor and using all of these other tools to improve their craft. Okay, well then how do the junior engineers of today become seniors? How do you actually teach the skills of tomorrow? Are they necessary? What does that look like, right? How does that evolve and how fast do these things move? So I think the question is pretty correct, and it's largely a provocation. And if we think about what's even happened between now and then, right, between Shopify, Tobias Lutke, and Duolingo
Yeah.
founder, whose name I can't remember right now,
It's
both
funny. I was like Shopify and Duolingo. They're both like, hey,
100%.
don't hire any more people if an agent can't do it. And I literally have them like written on my, I was like, oh yeah, we gotta
Yeah,
talk about
exactly. I mean, it's,
those.
it's between 6 weeks ago and today, two CEOs of two very successful companies who are probably also getting pressure from investors to say, wait, there are opportunities here to improve unit economics. There are opportunities here to go faster without more investment. Why wouldn't we take them? So I think I really loved actually the tone, candidly, of the Duolingo CEOs framing a little bit more, right? And but I think in both cases, right, it's, hey, we're not trying to downgrade the humanity that we have. What we're trying to do is say, how do we become more efficient? And I liken it, maybe it's naive to say it, but we used to do math on paper and then there were spreadsheets, right? Why would you ever go back to doing math on paper when there were spreadsheets? And then from spreadsheets to the next, to the next, to the next. This is just a much more massive evolution of the kind of productivity that we can achieve with a much broader span of reach.
Yeah. And so, what do you think? Should you replace all devs with coding agents?
Not yet. The short answer is not yet. But I mean, it was interesting. I did go back to my chief product officer and we started having some conversations. And what we have initially done, and what the team continues to do as I'm rolling on to future adventures, but what we initially did was say, hey, none of us know exactly how this is going to play out, right? There's, I think, making any sort of binary decision on that at this moment probably isn't in service of our clients, our customers, and the future of the business. That's so binary. But to say, number one, maybe like we're going to hold off on backfilling someone. Second, we're absolutely asking the team to identify, okay, what are the, 2 to 3 new test harnesses, rigs, tools, et cetera, that we're going to get 10%, 20%, 30% more efficient. So whether that's more story points, more this, more that, more code shipped within what we've done, less bugs, et cetera. That's like a no-brainer. That is minimum. And then the real question becomes, and where we hadn't gotten to yet, and this is actually the thing I kind of still want to explore, what are the questions we should be asking ourselves every time we make an investment to say, if someone attrits, should we backfill them? Yes or no? If we have a new need, how would we think about AI solving it before we hire somebody to do it? What are the parts of the job that nobody's having fun with that they want to automate out? All of those are the questions that I think are happening right now and could lead to a place where you have a very different look and feel. I do expect that people that are building from the ground up right now are also saying, well, what all can I do with agents before I even touch the idea of hiring anybody?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all that. I think something interesting in there that you just said, like, how do we get 30% more efficiency in terms of like code shipped or reduced bugs, right? Just that is a lifetime of sort of developer careers, and you're looking at like leveraged quality and leveraged volume. And so far in my own experience, the leveraged volume is really there. And the leveraged quality is really still a question mark. I'm like, I don't actually know if this work is leading to a reduction in bugs. And in other JD Talk sessions, I've like built things on the spot using Aider and Claude together. And I think of it as like a sort of a glitchy person walking down virtual land. It's like we just gave that glitchy thing a shovel and it's successfully shoveling, but like when you copy something's DNA and you don't copy it correctly, it's like missing some key ingredients. And so it's not actually stable, right? So it solves the job in the moment, but it doesn't have like a lot of sort of stability in its existence. And so I think that fleshing out those two ends of the spectrum is really, I mean, that's like kind of the work in a lot of ways. I don't know if you have any hands-on with that.
I don't have hands-on. I think I have two questions that are sort of on my mind. And my personal direct experience with this is actually more that my husband was trying to build something the other day in our house. And he like dabbles in development, but is kind of more of a mechanical engineer. So he needs code to run machines. And our front door is a machine. He actually built a really cool front door
Yeah.
and something had broken in his code that he wrote almost 10 years ago. And so he was trying to find, debug, fix. And I sat there and I was like, I was watching him and I heard him kind of grumbling about something. I was like, have you asked ChatGPT to help you with that? And
Yeah.
he's like, oh, you know what? I actually hadn't thought to ask it to write me code. Let me go see. And he comes back 30 minutes later. He's like, okay, so 3 prompts in, it produced better code than I can write. And right, it gave him something the first time that was like, then something better, something better. Now, and this is obviously very small micro use case, but after he said that saved me 5 hours. It's like that was an amazing suggestion, right? And it was just because it's not second nature yet to him. But when I can see a tiny use case like that working so well, the question is how do you apply it as AI keeps improving, right? As it starts to get better at context, right? Context is one of the biggest problems that we've got, right? If it can't hold state and context, then the learning that this bad shoveling thing does, right? If that learning gets lost every time, you're not going to improve quality. But if we're able to do a better job at creating that context or ensuring that the context stays steady so that it's got a baseline and it just keeps learning and getting better and learning and getting better, I think there is a lot of opportunity. So to me, the questions are twofold. Question one is how well are AI models and some of the tooling getting at holding context so that they improve? And question two, which we'll park for later, is how much do we actually rely on it? Like today, can you improve quality only by relying on it to write code? Or one of the things that we're actually doing, and I think is more interesting, is improve quality by asking it to run test cases that you didn't think of. Because I believe humans are quite bad at thinking about cases, corner cases, edge cases, the stuff that's going to break your code.
Hmm.
AI is great at coming up with 20 different scenarios and then helping you run tests against them instead of the human doing that. And it impacts code quality massively without the sort of mental gymnastics that you have to do over and over again. And it's a little bit of a checklist that's better than what a human can do. So to me, there's is it right? Is it only about the agent writing the code, or is it also about the agent improving quality through processes that you wouldn't do as well as a human? And then second is how good are they getting at state? So two totally different directions. I don't know if you have
I
thoughts on
love
neither.
I love how along this conversation you're like giving me breadcrumbs for all the mental models that are going into my workshops. And one of them is about like, hey, in the past, only developers were incentivized to be lazy, but now like everybody is actually in a certain way going to be incentivized to be lazy. And part of what you're talking about with testing is really in that vein. And as I've live coded, vibe coded, the AI agent is way better than me at writing error handling, right? Something that humans are just generally lazy about. But like an engine can just all of a sudden you have like 20 error handling controls that you would not normally write because people are trying to get you to go fast.
Uh-huh. Yeah, totally agree.
So that stuff is super interesting. So then there's two interesting things in there. One of which is like, is the is the tech is the tech transformational because it does the work or because it makes learning easier,
Mm.
right? And like was it transformational to your husband because it did his work for him or because it helped him learn and unblock his learning process?
In his case, I would say both, but alluding to your prior comment, like I think that's a little bit for me, at least in my very simple way of thinking about this. To me, that's the difference between just kind of LLMs and agentic, right? An LLM helps me learn faster, improve myself better. It's a great thought partner. It might speed some actual work, probably in the form of copy or code, like building, but it's not checking in the code. It's not finishing or completing the task. It's not doing the work versus the idea, or as I think about agentic, it's like, no, there's entire blocks of work that I can turn over to an agent to do for me on my behalf. So one is like they're both augmentation, but in different ways. And one is significantly more powerful, but requires more trust. So I think it's both, but I think to me, that's part of the evolution in the spectrum of moving towards agentic of doing more work for us versus just making our work faster, better, more thoughtful.
Interesting. And then I agree with you. And your clarity on these things is like super tight. Like it's like, wow, obviously you've been a product manager for a long time and you are a product manager through a lot of iterations of like organic non-tech products. Okay, now we have internet products. Now we have cloud internet products, like all those various layers, which
Mhm.
is really interesting. So you made me curious about something as we go back to this. Are we going to backfill? Are we going to train junior engineers, right? I think again, the HR bit, the HRM, hotel and restaurant management business, hotels have been presented with some of these questions a little bit earlier in various forms. And you see like the Hilton still kind of doubling down on we need to have these really effective training programs across the org because as you look at a really broad time horizon, you have no choice but to nurture the sort of the beginnings of the talent pyramid so that once like you can't get to year 8 with nobody in the pipeline because then you're super screwed. And it makes me think of like Starbucks, right? They tried to like outsource all the production of their coffee making. And that's like in the news, right? The new CEO is like, well, we doubled down on automating the experience, and maybe we just have to acknowledge that that is not actually working. That's not what people want.
Yeah,
I don't know if that,
I haven't read as much about that, but that's exactly the thing that worries me when I think about whether it's a dev, whether it's someone in hospitality, whether right, whatever industry, and actually the marketing stack is seeing it very much. A friend of mine, Carrie Liu, who was the CMO who took Atlassian public, she's actually been doing a lot of research in this space, and I think there's a something that's happening where marketers are going quite fast in terms of iteration using AI because there are so many use cases where it's directly applicable. But she's also seeing more and more small companies say, we're not going to hire or we're going to replace this role with a full AI. And what is exciting about that is an amazing efficiency play. What is terrifying about that is, to me, even goes back to education today. Can kids still write? And can those kids who write become marketers one day? Will they even need to write? What will marketing look like 20 years from now? Right? If it's agent to agent digital twin, who the hell knows? But there are so many foundational skills around logic, thinking, building, creating that if we aren't teaching people at the beginning, and for a dev, right, if you're not writing those first lines of code, how will you ever have an idea to understand the frameworks well enough to even work with an agent to define if they built something good? Or is it a
yeah,
race to the bottom in terms of quality? Because what we're doing now is great, and you're actually prompting things with people who have a lot of experience. And then over the years, less experience, less experience. Now the best thinking sits inside an agent. Is there still the creativity that we need? Is there still the innovation that we need? That is a big open question mark for me. That is a little scary.
yeah. I mean, I think that will become that will become like a pro skill because it's a time like it comes back to time, right? What am I going to invest my time doing? Like oh, I could like write out the alphabet to learn how to do it. That doesn't no one's going to pay me to do that, but it'll actually teach you phenomenal things about language. And it's a really critical skill for like neurocognitive development is like actually writing things by hand. Um, so I totally agree with you. I think the way you're approaching thinking about those end states is like I definitely I agree with those perspectives about how things could play out. I don't personally have the answers other than I think one of the goals of sort of entrepreneurship, and everybody's an entrepreneur now, whether or not they know it, because we're being driven towards a contractor sort of centric
Practically.
economy. And if you're an independent contractor, a free agent, you are an entrepreneur. You just might not be identifying with it.
Right.
A huge skill in there is like knowing how to invest enough time in something to understand how to coordinate or calibrate or give it feedback and to be creative without over investing in doing the work, right? Like that's critical. And I think you see that also in like physical fitness. We're always going to need some degree of time invested in these various things to produce useful outcomes. We can't be like, we're going to do zero work or we're going to invest zero in learning or zero in education.
Mhm.
Um, so then let's see, what is an agent in your world?
Mhm. Yeah, so I sort of touched on it briefly, but the way I think about agents, and it was funny, the first, I think, I heard the term agentic as we talk about it today, maybe a year ago. And it was also with this almost I think you said catnip, right? They're like, agenda. Oh, it's so exciting. Oh. But to me, the idea of an agent is someone or something doing full cycles of work or output on your behalf. And like if you take it back to the most old school, let's go travel agent. What did you empower a travel agent to do? You said, here are my criteria, here's my budget, here's what I want to go do, here are my likes and dislikes. And you outsource the entire thing to the agent. A great agent knows enough to make great decisions about you. A great agent also will come and ask you for feedback along the way and say, hey, I'm on the right track. Do I want to check in? How's this going? Here's a rough draft. Cool. I'm going to go book it. Right. That agent ideally is working with your ideas in mind, has the ability to get to a complete piece of work that is transacted and done, whatever done looks like, and has done so in a way that is either perfect to your spec or has enough feedback loops that it becomes perfect to your spec. And you have a certain level of trust in this agent. So to me, the elements that already exist are like, hey, can an agentic thing in AI do work? Yes. Can it give you feedback loops? I don't know. That's actually one of the ones I want to test out today, right? What does a feedback loop look like? And the third is how well can you trust it? And trust to me is probably the thing that I worry most about in a world of agentic, where, do I want to trust to give it my credit card to go book me something if I made a travel agent AI agent? Like, I don't know. I'd probably say I'm willing to give you up to $1,000, right? You have a budget of up to this. Anything that's more than that, you have to consult with me first, right? But maybe I would do that if I was training an executive assistant as my agent. So, and over time, we would build trust just as you would in a relationship. And then I'd be like, this EA gets me totally. You now have carte blanche to use my credit card to book $20,000 trips, and that's fine. So that was my long description of what I think an agent is.
It's interesting. It very much like in the real organic space. I wasn't expecting you to say any of that. I was expecting you to say like, mildly nerdy computer science stuff.
I think I expect basically that a computer science really can do all those things, right? If it can't do
Sure.
all those things, then is it really an agent? Is it really an agent, right? And I think we're seeing the use cases, anything from go book me travel to as an agent, go scrape the web and do research for me, all of those things. But how do the inner workings happen? That is definitely beyond my skill because I was never in CS. I don't have the computer science chops to talk about the details.
Sure. And I don't necessarily have the computer science chops to talk about the details either. I think the sort of the TLDR on the agent is sort of like code that can execute other code and do and take action, right? Like you're describing these systems that take action. And in my mind, I'm like all prior systems written before ChatGPT could all take action, right? So like what's the thing that makes the agent so popular now that didn't exist in the past?
Mhm.
And what I sort of coach people to think about, and I think you in prior conversation with you, you already demonstrated a really clear understanding of that with recent Ask Nicely product features. But what I try to get people to think about is it's easy to execute other code. It's easy to be like, go out and purchase this ticket or do this thing. The hard part is interpreting intention, right? Like that part is really, really hard. And that's what LLMs can be amazing at. Here is a document so long that it can't be read. What is the intention of that document, right? What is the intention of this news feed? What is the intention of this pattern, right? You have like a random walk of numbers that are like prices of, tickets to Tahiti or something, right? What is that pattern of numbers doing? LLMs are really good at like sort of sifting through these large corpuses of information and then being like the answer is 2 or 34 or blue or something, and then making an action,
Yeah,
right?
totally. But it goes back to the sort of idea that they have their own feedback loops. There's reasoning and then there's trust in a decision. So like we take the Tahiti example, right? If the LLM can see a pattern and says, oh, based on the parameters you gave me, there's 3 different flight patterns that will work for Tahiti, but I'm seeing that prices look amazing if you do this Tuesday to Tuesday thing instead of the Sunday to Sunday thing. So I know that you value both quality and budget, and that your time constraints are not too rough right now. So I'm going to book Tuesday to Tuesday for you because I understand the intention and I can interpret what this pattern means. And I think you're going to have a better experience in Tahiti because it won't be as busy.
Yes, awesome. And as a programmer, I'm like, I probably will have zero trust potential with a lot of agents
Yeah.
because it's very hard for me to believe any of these systems are actually good. Like I know that at the end of the day, it's still basically just a static sort of math waterfall interpreting, loosely speaking, interpreting things for me.
Okay, that's a question
Um,
I have for you, right? So the
sure.
you're saying like I don't have as much trust because I know it's kind of a mathematical waterfall. The earlier question I asked around like state and context, like what is your either experience or belief with you've given your agent or even ChatGPT or Claude, whoever, some context about John and like what you value and how you think about it. How good is it actually like from your perspective, keeping that and holding true to that over many transactions and interactions? How often does it lose it? When does it like, right? How often does it lose the plot for you? Because if it is, hey, every third time it loses the plot, man, it's real hard to build trust. But if it keeps the plot and keeps John's intention more often than not and is improving at that, your ability to build trust that even if it's mathematical, just like if you were going to tell, let's say you had an executive assistant, a human in real life who did it, right? That human is still using logic to go, this is how John makes decisions. And I have by and large a rubric. It's some sort of it's a little squishier, but it's a rubric. And they get it right 80% of the time. And you're like, yeah, that's worth it. I'm willing to take the risk on the 20%. Like, how do you feel about their ability to keep that context and keep the plot?
So you probably will like I'm almost like a Luddite in these matters in that I don't use GPTs to do that much work. And
Yeah.
so I don't actually have a lot of at bats with like establishing context
Mhm.
and paying attention to how well it maintains that context over time. Like I've built a business around very high value work that I do. And so there's not a lot of fluff that I feel compelled to like pass on to the GPTs. So mostly the work I use LLMs for is like help me understand perspectives broader than my own, which is already really deeply cooked into the LLM, right? Hey, I have this thought about Charlie Munger. Can you go dig up 10 other examples that I don't have time to go do, right? It just has to go find me that information. So I tend to ask it to do things that are very tailored to how it's already super well trained.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then when it comes to like programming, which I do a fair amount with, it's still pretty generic. So I don't have a whole lot of wash, rinse, and repeat with the particulars of John. I think that what will eventually have to emerge are like tiny little models that's job is to pay attention to your context. And then somebody will have to build some kind of a connector between the model that is basically deeply trained on Kirsten that then GPT-3 or GPT-4 or GPT-5 or GPT whatever, which is a
Whatever.
much
Please, Kevin.
larger thing, comes and then interfaces. And those two things will have to negotiate back and forth, but affect because you don't want to lose training context. But I,
No.
I think they'll eventually these problems will be worked out for certain types of problems.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's my many moons ago, I did a kind of 3.5 year stint at Gartner, and Gartner was very big on the concept of the digital twin, which at the time I was like, yeah, that sounds bogus. And I'll say, cool, some visionary thinkers, because I do think that what people are building right now to create context for who is John is essentially a digital twin, right? And it's
Yeah.
now how much power and trust and information do we actually give the digital twin? Like, am I going to give it my healthcare information so that it actually knows what decision to make for me? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I want it to have all of that. But
Yeah.
will I make it a thin twin? I'm going to create like new concept. I'm going to create a thin twin. My thin twin has just enough context to make some of the surface level decisions versus like the fully fledged Kirsten digital twin would have so much private data that I would probably be uncomfortable not having that live right here.
Yeah. Yeah, and that comes back to like how do you add value? A lot of the way I add value are like deeply unique to paying attention to something new and coming up with new thoughts about it.
Mhm.
I don't desire a digital twin necessarily, right? Like I'm doing the work that I love, and as long as I keep evolving with the market correctly, there will continue to be some value in that.
Mhm.
I have definitely considered making a twin, like an agent around like a product feature, sort of a deliverability versus cost matrix for like, what if you're like a CEO and I'm not available to talk to you right now?
Mhm.
And how would I think about those problems? So those are like really discrete types of agentic workflows that could be developed based on my imprint.
Yeah,
I don't know if you're a fan of like sci-fi,
a little bit.
but like Ghost in the Shell, which is like a very classic sort of anime, they have this whole idea of like your ghost, which is basically your digital twin, because
Mhm.
so much of your identity is going to be pushed into a piece of memory, like a like physical memory or RAM or something like
Fair.
that. And then so actually a lot of this, weird sci-fi from the 80s and 90s has actually explored a lot of things that we're just now getting to, which is super interesting.
It is cool. It is cool. Do you want to? I'm curious about your frameworks and what you're thinking about. Do you want to do a rapid fire through some of those?
Yeah, yeah. So I have 10 sort of bullet points that are loosely speaking mental models-ish. We can just go through them top to bottom and you tell me if you think they're interesting or I don't know, right? But they're
Yeah.
things that keep coming up in all these conversations. So I think they're relevant for people to hold on to, especially like a lot of people that I speak to are probably not as nuanced as you are in your understanding of like the balancing between like product and automation and tech, right? You're like a very sophisticated thinker on these topics. So like
Very
you
kind. I
probably
know.
know
I
all these
have a
mental
lot to
models
learn.
already. Okay, so the first one, specialization is still for insects, must smash skill boundaries, right? Does that mean anything to you?
No.
So it's
Like,
the idea
yeah.
that, and again, these may or may not be written down correctly, right? Like these are like the second time I've talked about these. So basically, the idea here is that a lot of work has been organized around people developing skill specializations because, like, as economies scale, we want people to get better and better at these things. And I think one thing that agentic workflows and LLMs are going to do is they're going to make it easier for like a non-engineer to build a thing, right? And so what we're going to see is an erosion of skill delineation. And it could be very scary to be an engineer and be like, oh my God, now all of a sudden Kirsten's going to take my job. And it's
Mhm.
like, well, there's actually a two-way street there. And that two-way street is really important to cross, right? Just as much as other people might now begin producing things, engineers should feel empowered to like go out and sell things. And I think that, right, like the antidote to being afraid to be replaced is to be like, well, how multidisciplinary have I actually become? Because multidisciplinary is everything. And that even is like probably deeply embedded in HR and hotels and stuff, right? Like if all you're doing is delivering food, you just have one role, but then the moment something over in the other part of the hotel breaks that you go deal with, it's like,
Very helpful.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think so as you describe it, I would agree that there's definitely truth to that. And in fact, right, whenever I think one of the reasons I shared earlier that I don't thrive in really big companies is because you're specialized into such a small niche that like candidly, it gets really boring. And one of the reasons startups are
I
so
can't do it.
fun is that you're like, oh, today I'm working on this problem, tomorrow that problem. Actually, most days, 10 different problems that intersect so many different things. And I think regardless of AI or not, the we call it the T-shaped person, right? Someone who is
Yeah.
deep in two or three things, but smart enough to be dangerous across many is actually a very powerful Swiss Army knife. But I do think that AI sort of rises the tide for everybody on, okay, maybe you are still only specialized in two or three things, but your ability to go like broad has actually gotten deeper, right? Where before I might have been like, yes, I learned to write a little HTML back in the day when we still had to code websites, but that's the last time I coded, right? AI, is not going to make me an expert. I probably won't replace a senior engineer, but it will probably allow me to very quickly write a couple lines of code that I feel confident enough to do something quickly, right?
Yeah,
And so that T shape starts to become like a chubby T, if you will. Like I'm going to use
yeah.
thin and chubby here as my analogies.
I'm gonna write that down on my list.
Yeah,
The
and then
chubby.
T-shaped skill set, I think, is a really interesting way to think about how will humans change and what will be the mix of specialization versus generalist that will make them more powerful. Because I do think as new companies emerge, right, we're seeing all of these folks who are instead of 200K ARR per FTE, which is a pretty good benchmark in SaaS, they're like $1 million, right? $1 million in ARR per FTE. If you're even talking about a recurring revenue model, that's 5x. How are they doing it? Not by hiring and building companies of hundreds and thousands of employees, but by creating really interesting sets of generalists who are good enough at many and using AI and agents to actually kind of build around them and create unbelievable things at greater efficiency.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Next mental model, tailored suits required. Have you ever worn a tailored suit?
I have. It's very nice when you have them.
Right. And like traditionally, most people have probably not worn a lot of tailored suits, right? And we've seen in the last decade a few companies kind of, have dug into like tailored clothing. But generally speaking, I don't think that many people are out wearing tailored suits, right? Could we kind of agree that maybe two in
Yeah,
10,
mass customization has begun, but it's still not to the masses.
yeah. And so I think this is an important mental model because in the last 30 years, organizations have had to basically pay for SaaS services where they might be using 30% of that SaaS service, right? And it's really been prohibitively expensive to build the exact operational stack that you want, right? Now it's actually becoming dangerous to not build exactly the operational stack that you want, right? So like if you look around the room as a company and everybody is not like wearing a tailored suit, you have to ask yourself why, because the cost of building suits is so cheap that like, would you prefer
Mhm.
to use 10 to 20% of like all these cobbled together SaaS systems, or do you now take your engineering and salespeople who are hopefully cooperating in more and understand that, like, you know what, actually, let's take the glitchy shovel man, right? Like, and especially in internal tools, stability is not as big of a deal, right? As long as the hole is being dug,
Mhm.
absolutely use exactly the shovel, exactly the process that you want.
Mhm.
And I think that leads into process, customer service, and logistics, which have kind of traditionally been like, oh, like only like nobody actually competes on those until you get really big when that's all you compete on, right? Like, and now I think is like a golden age for just like having incredible process, incredible customer service, and incredible logistics, no matter your size, because you're like, hey, we have exactly the process, we have exactly the systems that we want.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I think it's going to take some time, but some companies are moving really fast, right? What is I was
Startups are moving crazy fast on these
amen,
topics.
right? Like
Like
there's
I
definitely
I
we
can't even
jettison,
conceptualize it. I
no,
talk to people
we
and I'm like,
actually jettison some software that we were like, essentially we've been doing our best to not have multi-year contracts for ourselves, which is hard because we want our customers, of course, to have multi-year contracts with us.
yeah,
But we're also
yeah,
doing the same thing. We're like, well, so we're going to sign a contract with, software vendor X in marketing or in sales or in this or in that. But we're only going to sign 6 months or a year because we want to see how good it's going to be. And we want to see who else builds something better. And maybe we'll build it ourselves. And there are one or two where we have jettisoned something to say, actually, this is such a small bit and what they're doing is not quite 80/20 what we want. It's more right. We're paying for extra or shelfware and
yeah.
we can tune it. But
Shelfware.
and there are other areas where we're absolutely not. Like we're not going to go out and build our own CRM. That just doesn't make sense at this point. That's not a thing yet. So the question is when, how big, what systems, and what mission critical things remain. And it goes to me for a question. So tailored suits required, yes. And then, so here's the question is, based on your own core competency as a company, where are you still going to invest? Like, are you going to build out a whole internal team, small team, using agents to create your own software stack and support that yourself? And if it breaks, like, or do you focus on your core competency of dentistry or of whatever? Like when does that line blur and how fast does it happen? Because dental companies are still dental companies, they're not tech companies. But will they all become tech-enabled dental companies?
Kind of, right? Kind of. The answer is sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah, I love all that. And I'm just going to kind of move us
Yeah,
through because there's 10 and we don't want to be here forever.
sure.
Good devs are lazy devs. Now you too are a lazy dev.
True.
Um,
That's the same for salespeople. And lazy is always has that negative connotation, but it's really efficient, right? It's a code word for efficient, I think, in this case.
it's a code word for efficient, but also like especially in like AI driven engineering, right? Our job becomes to specify a problem,
Mm.
and an LLM has no choice but to usually find the path of least resistance between an input and an output state. Like that's basically how neural networks work, right? So like laziness is now a hard-coded feature rather than a defect to be sort of stamped out.
Yeah, agreed.
And then that leads to higher order thinking about like human skills are context, multi-spatial sensing, prioritization. And actually, I think that humans making errors is an important part of creativity, not necessarily to be frowned upon. A lot of really like incredible discoveries come from people being like, well, I spilled this stuff in the back room and something amazing happened.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, and figuring out what those how we elevate those human traits and still make them almost celebrate them, right? Because in a world where LLMs are doing a bunch of work for us and they might be right or they might hallucinate, it might actually feel harder to make a mistake. It might feel harder to do something that's creative.
Yeah.
So cultivating that is going to be important. I don't know how, but it's going to be important.
Yeah. And so then the next model, which is terribly named because I didn't know how to name it, so I just describe what it is, but it's called like Farnham, the Lollapalooza effect, and the theory of relativity. And I'm sure that's nothing.
It doesn't, it sounds like a fun party, but
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
yeah.
you're going for.
I don't even know how if I can try to explain this one. Basically, Farnham Street, I think, is a street that the Berkshire Hathaway headquarters are on. And it's also a consultancy in Canada that has created a really good book of mental models. And the Lollapalooza effect is what Charlie Munger talks about when you have like a bunch of models at play that start interacting with each other, and all of a sudden inputs and outputs become so there's no way to understand what you're going to get based on a given model. Um, and I think that in the future, the successful people will be the ones that have the broadest sort of set of mental models that they can work with in an extemporaneous manner, right? You don't necessarily need to be a specialist in the theory of relativity, but understanding a really broad set of principles that aren't actually all in tech, right? Maybe they're biological, maybe they're psychological, that comes back to that sort of multidisciplinary
Yeah.
smashing of skill boundaries.
Yeah. What you made me think of, and maybe it's a good naming convention, but I don't know, is that like of like a jam band, right? Where you just have you don't quite know what you're gonna get, but you put these things together and you might make magic. And each person is not only special at one or two things, but usually they can pick up a totally different set of instruments and just jam on.
I mean, I like that, and I love Ween. And Ween is like the most eclectic, weird. You just don't know what sounds you're going to get out of them until they like
Well,
master heavy metal and then jump into punk rock and then country. And
yeah.
this was next mental model was actually kind of the one that you brought up for me when we talked at the Red Fridge. This is the paradox of too fast cars and no speedometers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of where I'm going with that one?
I think to my sense, I think, is really around, you're building some things, but there's the governor on them is actually going to be the talent that is growing up. This is kind of what I think is we're talking about, but I don't know if that's where you were going.
So the model I have in my mind is like, hey, you're driving a car down the road, right? And maybe that car is steam powered, right? And somebody shows up and they're like, hey, buy this new faster car. You're like, oh, I want a faster car. And you look down and you're like, but how fast is my car going? And you're like, I don't know. And you're like, hey, how fast is your car going? And the person is like, I don't know. And I think that we're in a moment where people are talking about buying, they want you to buy a faster car, right? Those consultants wanted you to buy a faster car, but we actually have no established measurement for speed. And so
Mm,
how do we talk about the speed of, how do we talk about fast cars if we don't know what speed is? And that comes back to like, where is the value of a senior developer? Is it writing code or understanding how to teach people how to write code or solving a problem that's esoteric?
mhm.
And we're like looking at these replacement mechanisms without fully understanding what this sort of unit of input and output is. And I think that that's a very tricky thing to navigate, which comes back to, well, in 5 years, who's going to be left that knows how to do the job,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like the kind of person where I'm like, anytime at someone asks you a complex question, try to find some consistent metrics on the contrasting points. And I think that most people have pretty terrible metrics on the contrast of like developer productivity or designer productivity. Oh, 10x developers. Like I built my business on the idea that I don't believe 10x developers exist.
Mhm.
And I think that's just sort of catnip for people to talk about. And it doesn't actually ring. There are some incredible design, or excuse me, engineers out there, but there's no such thing as a 10x engineer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fair point. Like, how do you measure the productivity? And ultimately, like it comes down to the final metric that everyone in a boardroom is going to look at is like, hey, did we actually sell more of whatever the thing was for less input? But the steps along the journey to get there are fraught with peril.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, if I should replace myself with an agent and I don't, then that's a huge mistake. If I should not replace myself with an agent and I do, that's a huge mistake. Um, Next mental model is no yelling in the kitchen. I bet
I mean, I've
once
had
I
a
explain
sleepless
this
night. Once
one
you
will
explain it,
probably
I'll
make
be curious. I'm
sense.
like, what my brother and his family are, they're a little yelly in the kitchen sometimes because they have three kids and it's really excited. And I was like, oh, it's too much. Let's not yell in the kitchen. But I don't know where you're going with that. So I'd love to hear
What
it.
about in a professional kitchen? Why might somebody in a
Hmm.
professional restaurant? Why
Hmm.
why do people yell in the kitchen?
There's usually two or three reasons. One is safety, if something bad happens. Second is something is not seen. Be careful, get out of the way. Still safety, but it's not something bad happens. It's like I need to. Last is usually like order up, expediting. But yeah.
The other one is like someone from front of house comes into the kitchen and asks for something weird, right?
Yeah. And then people freak out.
Yeah, they're like, "What are you doing?" Or they come back and they make themselves something, or they do something in the kitchen, right? They do something that leads to all those other sort
Mm.
of things that you said to. And actually, Brian Chesky at uh, at Figma Config a couple of summers ago, he made this point, and he's like, if if I, as a salesperson, go into the kitchen of engineers and the engineers yell at me, organizationally speaking, I have failed. And I think that we're going to see this. This all comes back to the sort of, the line between skills just becoming so blurred that, like, hey, um, one, the CEO is the head of the product, right? If you're a tech company, CEO is always head of product. If head of product, if sales and engineering are not standing at the table together chopping and not standing out and greeting guests, encouraging to come into the restaurant, I think we fundamentally missed how LLMs are changing all these specializations.
Mm. Mm.
It's incredible how much like HRM there is embedded in this, and
Think
I
about it
didn't
that way.
know that. Yeah, yeah,
I
never.
mean, it's just a different kind of business, but it's one that everyone can understand. So it makes for great analogies.
Also, there's a principle that will I think drive home why we keep coming back to all this service stuff. Uh, we're not quite there yet. So I'll just do two more. Um, so I don't have a good title for this one yet, but the macroeconomic impact of engineering is actually almost already zero,
Mm,
right? If you knew what you were doing up until 2021, 2022, maybe, engineering costs like in San Francisco, you might be spending 500,000 a year on one engineer. But if you actually knew what you were doing, you could go find similar quality engineers around the world that would happily work for $50,000 a year. So you basically already had a 10x reduction in cost that was probably continuing to trend towards really inexpensive if you knew what you were doing. And what I think is important to think about there is that cost of engineering was actually already, in a lot of cases, approaching zero, and it didn't solve all of our problems, which means our problems are not about engineering costs. So this excessive focus on reducing engineering spend is a bit of a red herring, actually. It's not what is making these organizations so successful, right?
yeah, totally
And
agree. Actually, I was at a VC event last night, and the related thought here, I sort of asked this person because it was just like curious. I'm like, hey, the world is changing so fast. How are you deciding how to make bets? And they sort of stepped back through all the tropes and things that we might otherwise see. Like, well, we think, what is their moat? And the right now is almost nobody's moat is about what they can code. Right. Apparently, 20 years ago, there would be we wrote X lines of code and it's this thick and it's this big and it's this, that, and we did it and it's super special. And now it's like, no, in the same way of project, like lines of code, who cares? Right. If you can write it in two, that's better than 500. But who cares how many lines of code? Who cares? Like your technology moat, it's probably not a moat for very long, which defines this idea that maybe engineering goes to not to zero, but right, it becomes less and less of the critical factor. And I said, so then what are you betting on? He's like, well, then the differentiation has to be in distribution, relationship, brand, something else. And we are already seeing that in a lot of places because almost every category has 20, 30, 50 players.
yeah,
And not always that their tech is better is why they're winning.
yeah. And then I again this other concept, there's two more I won't go into, but this final one just to, get us off camera because we've been in here a while. Um, I don't have a great title for this one, but it's SEBS, not SaaS, which doesn't mean anything to anybody except me, but it's like or services enabled by software, not software as a service.
Yeah. Services enabled by software. I love that framing, whether the acronym stays or not, largely because I think that's already happening. Right. I think we're already in that zone. It's already underway. I got a weirdest promotion yesterday for something, and they were like, "Do you want to invest in this?" I was like, "Not for me." But it is a mobile waxing vehicle, right? They're going to drive around and do, treatments, eyebrow waxing, whatever you want, mobile. And I'm like, but the reason that they can even think about doing it is they're enabled by software, scheduling, mapping, pricing, da da da. Like, yeah, and there's service. The service is the thing that, like, until at some point a robot will do that. But for now, it is a service enabled by software. And almost all of the things that we're consuming that are becoming modern ways of delivery are that, regardless of what you're using. So I think that's really interesting. And agents are essentially creating those services.
Yeah.
Love
And
it.
then a couple of principles I have under this one is like, who woke up yesterday and said, I'm excited to buy software? You know, most people wake up to solve problems, right? Software has ate in the world, AI eating software. What's left is the service being provided.
Yeah.
You can take like Docker, for example, right? Docker is like a very complex tool. It's also open source. Its entire tech is there for the world. You don't get paid for Docker code. You get paid to know how to use Docker code, right? You get paid for the service that you can provide with the underlying tech. And I think as these systems grow ever more complex, it will be harder for anyone to navigate them. And that anyone will be a mix of AI agents and people cooperating. I don't think it'll be purely the AIs knowing everything. It's like we're also encountering a form of like digital bureaucracy where like, hey, if you want to get something done, you actually have to figure out how the system works, and that may or may not be published.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. And there's going to be places where, in fact, some folks do not want agents to be able to interact and therefore will sort of require, right? There'll be stage gates. Nope, get your human involved, whatever that looks like.